a challenge to dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain an individual presentation edited to stand alone. We hope you find them to be of value.
All right. So just wanted to thank Tom, Alexis, and the conference organizers for allowing me this space to offer some of my reflections on work relevant for understanding the upstream institutional and organizational determinants of refugee health. And the talk here is a little bit different than the abstract submitted in the program, but I'm still drawing on work that I do here locally in Oregon. I'm based at the University of Oregon with asylum seeker resettlement networks, folks who I refer to as informal or volunteer humanitarians. So thank you everyone for joining after lunch, and it's very nice to be with you all. So drawing from my ongoing activist anthropological involvement with immigrant rights movements in Oregon, in this paper I examine immigrant detention as one form of structural violence shaping unequitable access to opportunities for health among precariously statused migrants in the United States. A review of the history of immigrant detention reveals the ways that hierarchies of deservingness are built into carceral treatment of migrants by the US state. My ethnographic work with a local group of volunteers aiding asylum seekers in Oregon offers insights into how informal humanitarian efforts to assist refugees and other migrants may unwittingly reinforce these hierarchies, sorting different groups as more or less worthy of social care. The case study I draw upon in this paper comes from my ethnographic engagement with an all-volunteer group of local humanitarians that has mobilized since 2018 to aid asylum seekers, and who I refer to as the Oregon Asylum Network, or the Network. So after providing a brief background surrounding the group's formation, I will focus here on one specific dimension of their efforts, which is establishing a bond fund designed to release asylum seekers and other migrants from detention. Through a brief analysis of the dynamics surrounding the bond fund's deliberations over who to help, I show how local humanitarian relief efforts unwittingly reproduce the inequities embedded in state systems of migration governance. In both cases, formal, legal, and informal humanitarian, unequal hierarchies of care are built into immigration systems in ways that perpetuate legalized forms of violence. Hierarchies that are reinforced by humanitarian efforts and unwittingly foreclose opportunities for inclusion rather than contesting exclusionary laws, policies, and practices. Through this close attention to contested dynamics of asylum seeker governance, this paper casts a critical analysis on the policy, institutional, and organizational influences that shape opportunities for health and well-being of asylum seekers and precariously statused migrants. Situating my engaged ethnographic work with an activist immigration bond fund into this conversation about refugee health is part of the conceptual shift that I think many of the presentations since this morning have been making in such a productive way, a conceptual shift towards the structural and policy level factors that shape migrant health and well-being. In global public health, we would refer to this focus we would consider this focus as attending to upstream or macro level social determinants of health, the policy, legal, institutional, and community level nested influences on the health of individuals. Parsing out the nuances of immigration policy or federal rule changes and the ways immigration bureaucracies treat asylum seekers is analytically tedious and perhaps less ethnographically exciting than other forms of field-based research that some of us anthropologists long to do. However, anthropological analysis has a great deal to contribute to the critical, discursive, and what our friend Faye Harrison might argue is a much needed decolonizing perspective on the ways US immigration policies, past and present, reproduce racist and xenophobic constructions of belonging embedded into the structures of immigration governance. To frame immigrant detention as a structural determinant of health of migrants and asylum seekers is to consider a violent exclusionary feature of what Agamben and other social theorists would call the sovereign power of the state. We might also consider detention a form of political cruelty, which Cristina Beltran has recently argued is apparent in the ways in which white privilege in the United States relies on the unjust and cruel treatment of immigrants and thereby sustains what she calls white democracy. An outlier when considering the treatment of asylum seekers in global perspective, in the US, many asylum seekers are subjected to prolonged periods of detention as part of their journeys. While full exploration of detention as a tool of migration governance is beyond the scope of this paper, I will outline several key features of detention to provide a background for understanding the Oregon asylum network with which I work. Immigration detention in the US is a contested field. I'm sorry, I think I went one too far. Is a contested field deeply intertwined with a country's colonialist history and present-day carceral regimes of state power. Since the 19th century, the detention and forced removal of migrants in the US has reflected racialized notions of which migrants are deemed worthy of residing in the territory and which can be forcibly expelled or deported. For instance, in 1893, the US Congress gave immigration officers discretionary power to determine which migrants to detain and which to release, which began the system of bond payments to securitize migrants released from detention. This system of bond was further codified in the 1952 Immigration and Nationalization Act, and by the 1980s, the privatization of immigrant detention in the US began to expand exponentially, with the largest federal contracts made with the groups GEO, Corrections Corporations of America, now CCA, or CoreCivic. The immigration detention system has steadily expanded into the 21st century, with federal spending on these facilities topping $600 million by 2017. With over 200 immigrant detention centers, the US holds the nefarious distinction for having the most such facilities of any country in the world. Whether operated by private companies or municipal governments as jails, immigrant detention centers house different categories of displaced people, among them asylum seekers, undocumented migrants detained in the US interior, and all categories of immigrants deemed by ICE to having committed a fraction, even a minor one. Currently, an average length of stay in US immigration detention facilities is about a month. However, migrants may be released after a day, or they may be held for more than a year. Cases vary by facility, region, and the disposition or humors of immigration judges. While obtaining accurate and current information about immigrants held in detention is difficult, the Syracuse University hosted track system uses FOIA requests to make data on immigration courts and detention centers publicly available. It's a great resource. From track, we learned, for instance, that bond fees set by immigration judges vary widely by EOIR court, that's the Executive Office of Immigration Review, or immigration court. So these bond fees vary by court, region, and city, ranging from $1,000 to over $25,000, but the average is about $5,000 nationwide. To date, in 2021, there were 900, at last count, last time I checked track, 950,000 immigrants currently in detention seeking bond, and an estimated half will be granted release, just half. By nationality, the largest groups of immigrant granted release from detention are Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and Honduran. Furthermore, according to track, the number of cases and average wait time for a case to be settled in EOIR court has steadily increased over the last 15 years, reaching a backlog of over 1 million cases by 2020, and average wait times today at about 1,000 days, 1,000 days, or more than 3 years. That's for an asylum seeker placing their petition in court will have to wait more than 3 years for their merits hearing to determine their case. When faced with the realities of how capricious and cruel immigration detention and release decisions are, the volunteer humanitarians in the Oregon Asylum Network expressed bewilderment and disbelief. Network volunteers wish to identify some rational basis for why certain asylum seekers are admitted at the border without detention, why others might be released quickly with low bond, and others still detained for months without the possibility of bond at all. The capriciousness of asylum decisions seems to reflect a number of factors, among them individual border officers and immigration judges' prejudices, home country geopolitical affiliations with the United States, which partly explains, for instance, why Cubans or Nicaraguans are treated differently and detained with less regularity than Haitians or Hondurans, and gender and racialized ideas about deservingness, about which we've heard a little bit this morning. In the face of this uneven state application of any real rule of law, volunteer humanitarians' affective responses to the illogic of the immigration legal system belies what cultural theorist Lauren Ballant would have called cruel optimism, or sustaining belief among white liberals in a functioning, rational, transparent democratic state, even when faced with mounting evidence of the state's cruelty and capriciousness. So it's in this context that an Oregon network to aid asylum seekers was formed in 2018, when a group of concerned residents, some interfaith activists, some volunteers with refugee resettlement efforts, and some folks new to activism came together in the small city of Eugene, where I live and work, in response to the highly publicized groups of asylum seekers converging on the US-Mexico border, many of whom were traveling with the Caravanas Emigrantes through Mexico. And these caravanas used the media attention given to them, which was aggravated, of course, by our then president and his Twitter storms, to highlight their human right to asylum. As an activist, anthropologist, and feminist ethnographer engaged in ongoing research around immigrant rights organizing in Oregon, I participated regularly in meetings of this group of volunteer humanitarians across 2018 and 2019, taking notes, helping set up web pages, writing policy briefs, and presenting relevant information from my expertise in migration studies. My participation in the network waned across 2020. Meetings did go remote, and I've begun participating again. The initial impetus for the network was volunteers' sense, in their own words, that they just had to do something to aid asylum seekers, and many were mobilized by outrage at perceived unjust treatment of migrants and the mediatized images of migrants waiting at the US-Mexico border, some of which are on the slide for this conference. So by December 2018, several Eugene activists had joined mass mobilizations taking place in Tijuana and other border cities through organizing being done at the time by the New Sanctuary Movement and the Sanctuary Caravan, among other groups. While at the border, a number of local activists signed on to be sponsors for individual asylum seekers. This meant aiding asylum-seeking friends, as they called them, in filling out their I-589 forms, securing release from detention, and then later finding housing in Eugene and ultimately resettling in the local community. It became clear to volunteers that aiding individual asylum seekers involved a great investment of time, resources, and emotions. And they had to confront the reality of the high bond payments and exorbitant legal fees required to win a single asylum case against their desire to help many asylum-seeking people. So one subcommittee of this Oregon Asylum Network came to focus on establishing a bond fund in order to release asylum seekers from detention, which is called the Cascade Immigration Bond Fund. As I have been involved with the fund since its inception, I have observed some of the ways in which this humanitarian effort unwittingly reinforces troublesome hierarchies of deservingness and social care that are built into migration governance. For instance, in early meetings of the Bond Fund Committee, network volunteers joined staff of local nonprofit immigrant serving organizations, all of whom talking about the need to support the release from detention of all immigrants with ties to our local county, whether asylum seekers newly arriving from Central America or Mexican Americans undocumented but with long-standing family and employment ties to our county. Of course, Bond Fund Committee members recognize that in order to aid all immigrants with ties to our region currently in detention, a large amount of funds would be needed. Still, the intent of the Bond Fund at its inception was to be as inclusive as possible, encouraging donations and donors to consider all groups as equally worthy of freedom from detention. Because volunteers had little experience in the administrative bureaucracy required with releasing folks from detention, a partnership was formed with a Bay Area organization called Freedom for Immigrants, a 501c3 organization based in the Bay Area of San Francisco. This partnership had impacts both concrete and ideological. On the material level, network volunteers could encourage donations to FFI as tax deductible. And on an ideological basis, the FFI partnership tied the local bond fund to a broader national movement aimed at ending immigrant detention. Despite these activist and broadly inclusionary aims, fissures soon emerged within the bond fund, contradictions that mirror broader forms of state exclusion. A first question, how to determine eligibility for the fund, was intensely and is intensely considered to date. Some thought network affiliated donors should be able to earmark donations to particular asylum seekers that network members were sponsoring. On the other hand, nonprofit staff working with long-standing immigrant-serving organizations countered that donations should be pooled and that a fair and open application process with a transparent review committee representative of the different organizations involved should review applications and determine priority. Everyone involved recognized that the need for the fund would be greater than our ability to fundraise. However, volunteers were motivated by those exclusionary ideals that I mentioned earlier. The fissures encountered by the Bond Fund Committee revealed different ideas about who is deserving of assistance. In the face of high bond fees, network volunteers knew they needed to raise at least $10,000 before they could help any one individual. But so many immigrants in detention with ties to our county needed and still need help. This led to trying conversations in Bond Fund meetings where volunteers confronted the mismatch between the magnitude of need and their limited resources. A common refrain in meetings is, "We just can't help everyone." So who would be helped? With their limited resources, CIBF, the fund, had capitalized to about $6,000 by December of 2019, so a year after its inception. The Bond Fund Committee made the decision to help asylum seekers sponsored by network volunteers. One argument made in behalf of this decision was that since network volunteers were doing most of the fundraising, their asylum-seeking friends should be prioritized. Deliberations over whether to help women and children over single men or relatives of asylum seekers already in Eugene continue, hotly debated topics. To date, just 2 individuals, both sponsored by network volunteers, have received Cascade Bond Fund assistance. With the volunteers currently in this moment focused on a renewed fundraising campaign, these questions over who to help are likely to reemerge, and responses will reflect the troubling realities of limited resources and the capricious humanitarian calculations about who is most worthy of care. Perhaps unwittingly, the volunteer humanitarians involved with the Bond Fund are participating then in a troubling reinforcement of state systems of migration governance and enforced exclusion, reinscribing troubling hierarchies of deservingness and care. These fissures are illustrative of broader issues of deservingness central to critical humanitarian studies, arguments that my friend Charles Waters made earlier. To sum up, this question might be posed as, who decides which migrants are morally worthy of inclusion and social care? And this question leads me to another, which is what might an alternative to exclusion and political cruelty look like when facing the vast needs of forcibly displaced migrants against the limitations of resources and care that exist? Or put another way, rather than reinforcing exclusionary narratives of state and legal regimes of migration management, how can volunteer humanitarian efforts like the one I profile here use local activism to broaden the boundaries of membership, inclusion, and citizenship? I think one possibility comes from this Bond Fund work, where advocacy groups like Freedom for Immigrants configure the work of aiding individual migrants in their search for release from detention as part of a broader political aim of ending all immigrant detention and all carceral systems of state treatments of migrants. So with that, I'll end, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yarris. And I just wanted to repeat your introduction briefly. I don't think that it was heard by our attendees online. So Dr. Yarris is Associate Professor of Global Studies at the University of Oregon, and we certainly appreciate your talk today. So I just wanted to open it up for some question and answers.
Hi, Kristen. This is Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Catherine.
Oh, hi. This might be a quite naive question, but I'm always struck when I talk to humanitarian workers that the issue of triaging according to need is non-problematic, because that's what needs to be done to save lives. The way you portray it, it's very deeply problematic to look at hierarchies of deservingness and suffering. But can you tell me a little bit why triage in a humanitarian crisis situation is not problematic, and why it becomes problematic when you're moving into a state that has resources for all and where the social contract is weak? I'm still trying to kind of figure this out.
Your question is articulate, and I'm not sure my response will be as articulate as your question is.
I'm saying is the reason why triage here is so problematic because we have the resources and a social contract to look after people, and then it's not so problematic in a crisis situation where humanitarian first responders are trained to triage according to need. In other words, we seem to be making that problematic. But what I'm saying is, in conversation with humanitarians, that's never necessarily problematic in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do understand the question. And I'm wondering about this in relationship to the question I posed in response to Charles's talk before lunch. That is, how do we imagine migrants as maybe equally deserving and aspirational subjects, and yet recognize the limitations of humanitarian efforts to aid them? And I can only respond to this in terms of what, in this particular ethnographic case, there was a moment of opportunity, I think, to transcend some of these hierarchies that I'm describing in the paper, that was foreclosed upon. And I think it's foreclosure. Actually, I've written about this a little more. I didn't have time to read it all. It's foreclosure that is an opportunity for a much broader conceptualization of who was deserving in this case and who are the members of our local immigrant community. That foreclosure hinged on issues of race, class, and gender in really troubling ways at a particular moment in the bond fund's origin story, if you will. And so all I'll say, without going into that in ethnographic detail, is that there was a moment in which these folks decided that the newcomers, were more worthy than the long-standing migrants. And it was kind of an explicit decision, but it was contested by nonprofit staff, themselves largely Latinx, and many of whom young women of color, who pushed back on this narrative of who needed to be helped. And I think that was really unfortunate, because at that moment, there was a refugee resettlement coalition at the table. There was a social service organization serving our Latinx communities at the table. And then there was this new emergence of new activists at the table. And when that decision was made, that coalition fell apart. So I don't know, I can only sort of respond in terms of that ethnographic case, but I'm also trying to imagine humanitarian futures in which we don't have to triage in this way, and where all people are worthy of membership. And I know that's like very idealistic configuration, but I think that's where my thinking goes along these lines.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have a question about the current situation in Oregon in terms of the different populations that are there and arriving. Who are the people who are coming most right now, and what are the main populations of immigrants, or what are the main immigrant communities there currently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's quite diverse, and it depends on county and region. So folks arriving officially categorized as refugee right now, there's a new wave of Afghanis who are being brought by the official refugee resettlement channels. There's a long-standing refugee resettlement channel into the Portland area, folks from all over Africa. And so there's a strong African refugee community there, and refugee serving organizations serving African refugees. And in my county, there's it's like a mixed flow of Central Americans, including a number of indigenous mom-speaking folks from Guatemala who work they're brought here through agricultural labor streams. So they look like economic migrants, but they're applying for asylum once here. So people refer to them as refugees. So these categories don't really match people's realities. The folks at the asylum network that I work with are resettling are largely Central American, because it tends to be that Mexicans are getting released. Mexicans seeking asylum are getting released without detention or without bond. And so Mexicans are arriving here as asylum seekers, but they're not needing the help of this network in the way that Central Americans are. So, and then of course we have long-standing communities of Mexican American immigrants and new waves of folks from California. We're being pushed north by climate change and labor migration.